Okay, let's get started. Good evening. My name is Barrett Jones, and tonight's webinar is Conducting a Multiplayer Digital Music Jam. We're going to talk about how to use different Korg products to have a music workshop for teens and kids. So let's take a look at what we'll be talking about tonight. First, a little background about my own work, some thoughts about reaching kids and teaching kids music, and then we'll move on to the specifics. Last week, my webinar focused on setting up a multiplayer digital jam, so I covered all the different essentials about hooking up the equipment. This is part two. This week, we'll be examining how the different stations function, as well as the role of mixing and how to the process of recording the music, and then a summary of what we cover. So we're going to have some diagrams and videos to accompany the specifics. But first I'd like to talk a bit about Beat Club, which is my music workshop that I teach in the District of Columbia. Uh, I have been teaching Beat Club since 2011. I developed this workshop with several different ideas in mind. The first was to teach music. The second was to teach music to beginners. The third idea was to teach music to beginners in a fun and open way. And then the fourth idea was to teach music to beginners in a fun and open way at the place where they congregate. So I needed something to be portable and accessible and durable. And it turned out that the Korg Chaos series, the Chaos pads and the Chaoscilators, uh, are a perfect fit for what I was looking for. Um, what this basically entails is bringing these touchscreen synthesizers to schools. Here's a middle school in Arlington, Virginia. Um, Here's a outdoor street festival in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Washington, D.C. You can see yours truly at the mixer in this picture. What this really involves is bringing digital technology that is easy to use and accessible to kids where they're at, whether it be a street festival or a classroom, and giving them the opportunity to play and collaborate together to make music. Um, this is actually a good shot because it shows the basic setup, at least how it was a couple of years ago. The actual equipment have changed, but the essential principle is still the same. There's multiple player stations. In this photo, you can see that there's four sheets. Those represent four different stations, and you can see a microphone in one of the kids' hands, and you can see some oscillators on the table. And all these different pieces of equipment are used by the kids to work together to create music, dance music. And my role here is to show them the basics and then to really run the mix and sit back and let them just have fun, have a good time. And that's what happens. Uh, the the Beat Club, no matter where it is always really popular with the kids because the machines are they're sophisticated. There's hundreds of different sounds on them, and then combined together, they produce endless combinations of different sounds. There are pre-programmed beats um, which can be manipulated very easily using a touch screen. And so, especially for a generation who's used to game controllers and other digital devices, it's quite easy for them to pick up and use this equipment. And what it does is it teaches them essentially the fundamentals of making music, because they have to work together to think about such issues as tempo, um, time changes, and incorporating different players into the mix. And what happens is oftentimes there's four stations, but there can be groups of 10 to 15 kids, some listening, others rotating through. So, for example, people take turns at the microphones or take turns creating beats, trying different things. And my role really is at that point sitting back and just letting the fun flow, and which it does. Um, this equipment is sophisticated, high-end professional equipment, so it's capable of a lot of different things, and um, it's vastly entertaining for adults. So for kids, especially, given a little bit of instruction and then just allowed to uh, have fun and play and hack, um, it's these are the perfect pieces of equipment. Uh, and also, because they're made for professional musicians, traveling musicians, they're durable. There's not a lot of moving parts, and they don't require, for example, system upgrades or anything. The circuitry and everything is solid, and some of this equipment I've been using for years, hundreds of sessions, and it's still holding up and still very usable. And what I also want to emphasize with uh, teaching kids, especially in some of the communities where I bring Bee Club, uh, it's important to also recognize that with much of this equipment, there this is not available or not even an option for kids in some neighborhoods. And you know, they say that music is universal. The enjoyment of music is universal, but access to the means to make music is not universal. And another thing that I'm working on trying to do is bringing these instruments, this equipment, to communities where there aren't many options for the young people in terms of creative outlets. Schools are cutting back on music education programs. Parents don't have the disposable income to buy a synthesizer or a chaos pad. And so this also fills the role of teaching the next generation uh, how to use digital technology and how to collaborate. And that's something that can be used, that comes in handy regardless of whether it's technology or not. Things like listening, collaborating, working together, solving problems. You know, in many of these pictures, you can see kids working together, pointing things out, um, giving each other cues, talking it, discussing, try this, do that. They're curious, and what these photos don't convey is the sense of enjoyment and the excitement and some of the craziness that happens when you give young kid or young people, kids, really anyone of any age, these instruments and allow them to play. So moving along here, because there is a lot to cover, I just wanted to have a quick slide about music education. And I touched on some of this already, but I do want to emphasize that these touchscreen synthesizers offer an alternative to the traditional music education. Um, as a former student of band in third grade, I was assigned to play the cornet, and so I went to the music store with my mom, rented it, brought it home, and blew into it. And for the next few weeks, just couldn't get anything out of there other than horrible noises. Meanwhile, struggled to read music in band at school, and overall had a miserable experience that left me ultimately quitting band. And then years later, I got back into music through playing guitar, through uh, garage rock bands, and that sort of thing, which then opened up a whole new sphere of making music and then introduced me to the path that now I find myself on as a professional musician and music educator. So my point is that the traditional instruments, the violin, the guitar, something that they take years to master to get a good sound out of, as many of you know. Whereas the digital instruments offer um, a much lower barrier to learning. There's a much it's a far more really immediate gratification. However, I think the most important thing to think about in music education is sparking the interest of the student, and and everything else will follow. But what has to happen first is that the student needs to be engaged, and I believe that these digital instruments allow um, kids to become interested in music and play music, um, who otherwise would not succeed in the traditional route of music education. There's plenty of room for both, and many succeed and are value the the experience of a traditional music education. But there is another cohort that don't fit into that, and that's the group that I'm talking about that I think are particularly good candidates for this kind of music workshop. Just a quick note, I'm working with the District of Columbia Public Library on a project where we're going to bring this setup that I'm going to talk about tonight to 10 libraries in the District of Columbia. So these are all libraries that have hosted Bee Club over the past 3 summers, but now we're looking at implementing this as a permanent program. So stay tuned for that. So now let's get into the details of the actual digital jam session. Last week we talked about the equipment and how to set it up. In this particular scenario that I'm talking about tonight, the types of equipment we have are 3 Kaossilator 2 touchpad synthesizers. Then we have a KaosPad Quad touchpad synth. We have a Shure microphone, a Mackie mixer, and a Lucas Nano speaker system. Now, you'll have to refer back to last week's webinar to get an overview of the details of the Lucas Nano and the Mackie. Especially Lucas Nano really doesn't appear too much in what I'm going to discuss tonight, since it's basically just the output for the music that's being created. So this is the diagram that you might recognize if you were watching last week's webinar. As you can see, they are basically 4 stations that all feed into a mixer. 3 of the stations are the Kaossilator 2s that I mentioned. One's the KaosPad Quad. The KaosPad Quad has a microphone coming into it. So all 4 of these stations are coming into 4 channels on the Mackie mixer. And of course, it can accommodate 4 more channels as well, but we keep it at 4 just to sort of keep things simple, at least in this example. As noted in the previous webinar, but I want to point out again in case you didn't see that one, the mixer has a USB out, and that you can connect to a computer running GarageBand or Audacity or any program that's going to record sound. So the mixer has a USB out that you attach to the computer for recording. Mixer also has a main out that then goes to the speaker system. The speaker system in the setup that I have been using is the Lucas Nano. However, any other speaker system will suffice. So what's happening here now is that I'm now showing really what the stations are in the Music Jam. I've divided them up into beats, bass, chords, and vocals. For this particular combination, it's really not so much what the individual equipment is, it's more trying to get the students to focus on different aspects of a song. And when you think about most dance music or electronic music, there's a beat implied or present, bass, chords, and chords meaning piano, organ, or perhaps just something in that sort of frequency range. And then vocals of some sort. Of course, every song doesn't always have all four components, but just for the sake of a group workshop activity, this is how I've devised the setup. So now we'll go through and talk about each one of the stations. But before I do, I just want to focus here again on the diagram and explain that this can accommodate 4 students. One at beats, one at bass, one at chords, one at vocals. But it could also accommodate 5 so that they could cycle through, or 6, or 7, or 8. 2 could pair up at every station and then rotate through. I've rotated probably groups of 20 to 30 kids through 4 stations like this. The trick really is to just keep going fast and keep encouraging people to cooperate, and they'll self-organize many times. And also the trick is to have cheat sheets, printed sheets that have some different options that they can immediately dial to and find. So this this configuration is road tested. So let's take a look at the different pieces. This is the Kaossilator 2. This is one of the pieces of equipment that we'll talk about tonight. Here's a program list for the Kaossilator 2. As you can see, there's a lot of different options on here. But for the sake of this particular first series, we're going to take a look at, it's set to bass. We'll just take a quick demo of how you play this. By touching the screen. It's very simple, very easy to use. Other webinars focus more on the specifics, but just to give you a general overview, you can make loops. It has the ability to make 2 separate loops. And you can add sounds to the loop. So this is a single station that has this option. Think about 2 loops. Think about 3 different stations that are Kaossilator 2s, each one of them having the ability to loop 2 loops at a time. So many different possibilities for each one of the players. And there's some onboard controls on the Kaossilator 2 allowing to change, for example, the length of the loop from 4 beats to 8 beats. A lot of things you can do with this equipment. Here's I've changed it to 8 beats. Now I've got an 8-beat loop. Let's move on. So let's take a look at the beat station. There are basically two options for making beats on the Kaossilator 2. One is to use the drum kits, and the other is to use drum patterns. I would recommend for most beginners and for most of the time that you focus on showing drum patterns to the players. So as you can see, PT, which stands for pattern, precedes then the number assigned and then a short description of what each beat is. Um, so you have a lot of different options here. Let's take a quick look at how house, what you can do with the PT-126 house beat. And then let's take a look now at the drum kit, which is really just a one-shot, one-tap generates one sound setting, unless you use the arpeggiator function, which actually can produce a lot of really interesting patterns. They're kind of off. Some of them are a little bit off the wall. Let's take a listen. So you can easily just do a loop with these different individual drum sounds. You could just do a simple 1, 2, 3, 4 tap and build a disco beat using this different kit, or depending on obviously what kit has different sounds. But now I turn on the arpeggiator, the arp button, and you can see that starts to repeat the effect. Notice I'm using the function button to get to this menu selection, which is can change the ARP swing. So I'm changing the ARP swing, and that begins to change the arpeggiator pattern, creating some really interesting rhythm combinations. And so then I can go ahead, once I find something that I like, I can loop that if I want to. And you get the idea in terms of the beats. Um, let's go on to the bass station now. Same principle. The bass station begins with B and then S. These are all different bass sounds that are available to the Kaossilator 2. So a player has access to a lot of different sounds. And then the chord station, the same thing. All these different chords are now available to the player at the chord station. A quick little sonic tour of the different chord sounds. So as you can see, you can get a lot of different sounds. I encourage you to experiment with these different setups. So now at this point in time, we have the 3 Kaossilator 2 stations. We have beats, bass, and chords set up. The 3 stations are running into 3 separate channels on the mixer. So then the fourth component is vocals, and this is where we use a KaosPad Quad, a different piece of equipment. Same principle though as a touchscreen synthesizer, and we combine this with a microphone. This is a diagram of the different effects that are available on the KaosPad Quad. You can see there's basically 4 different categories. The idea is the input comes in and 1 is the first selection, 2, then 3, 4. So running through a sequence of different aspects and effects being applied to the signal at different points in time. Um, let's take a quick look at setting up the Chaos Pad, or the Chaos Pad Quad. Plugging the microphone in, using the
test. Beat Club.
Use a looper with the looper activated. I can change the tempo on the loop. I'm doing this just by keeping my finger down, still using that original sample to slow down the tempo of the loop. Now I can hold that loop and use one of the effects in 2. The flanger, for example. Or the pitch shifter now in the 3rd group. Remember, all these can be combined or standalone using the vocal input. And I should emphasize that you don't have to use the looper. I just like to use it, and it's often times the kids have fun, but I could, for example, just use the flanger or use the flanger and the pitch shifter. So when it comes to mixing, it's essentially the 4 stations are the first 4 channels. We looked in the last week's webinar at the setup and how to where to plug things in. So let's just take a quick look now and see the mixer in action with the different stations running. Here in this example, you can see I have 3 stations running. I'm running the bass station. And then the chord station and then the pattern station. So I have the beats, bass, and chords running. And I use the faders to emphasize individual tracks or combine them as the players are playing. And then the final thing to touch on is recording. This is very simple, really. We don't cover the computer program in this for recording in this webinar. We will in future webinars. So the main emphasis really is just that to remember that using the Mackie mixer that I'm talking about in this webinar, there is a USB out, and any mixer that you're using these days should have a USB out, which will connect to your computer. We'll listen to this snippet in a minute, but just to summarize, Beat Club, this digital music jam session, which I present as Beat Club, but what I'm offering to you to present however you would like, is suitable for all levels, from beginners to advanced. Really, any level of musician can enjoy this particular workshop. And I should also emphasize that many times I have parents playing with their kids, families together, and so it also can be multi-generational, something to think about. There are 4 stations in this configuration we looked at tonight: beats, bass, chords, and vocals. The recommended length for a workshop is 60 minutes in terms of rotating groups through the 4 stations. It really depends on how many kids you have, but if you want everybody to have a good experience playing at each station, usually it takes a while, so plan on roughly an hour at the very least for this kind of thing to get going. Of course, whatever parameters you work within, you will probably find that whatever works best for you. But I would recommend 60 minutes. And then note that you can record to the computer. Um, in my case, I record to GarageBand and export the recording as an MP3, which I then post to the web and make available to the participants. So that's an important thing to think of too. It's a digital jam. It can be recorded digitally and can be shared digitally, all very easily. So I'm going to end now playing just a few snippets from Bee Club in Baltimore, made by some young kids at Utah Marshburn Elementary School. And I thank you very much for listening tonight. I'll be back next month talking about some further uh, aspects of Digital Music Jam, including the process of exporting and uploading music files to free music websites that are available on the web. So we're going to have a overview of some of the resources for teachers out there for sharing music. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.